Hello, I'm Debbie Bell-Hosking for FinextraTV in Stockholm at NextGen Nordics 2024. And I'm joined by Emily Corfield of StoneX. Emily, welcome.
Hi Debbie, thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. We've had a big buzz around us this morning, and you've just watched a panel on real-time cross-border payments in emerging markets, where you have a strong presence, for example, LATAM, Africa and Asia. So could you set the scene for us? Give us an idea of the state of play.
Yes, absolutely. So I think first of all, what's really important to point out is actually the difference in the cross-border payments landscape when it comes to your liquid and developed markets, your G20s versus your emerging and frontier, because they can actually differ quite dramatically. So in your emerging and frontier markets, there are often infrastructural challenges that can be quite complex, and there's often reliance on a lot of these manual processes, in fact. And so when it comes to real time, there's still a lot to be achieved. So I think also what's important to also distinguish as well is your P2P versus your B2B payments, again, when it comes to real time. If I'm sending a remittance payment cross-border, let's just say, into Brazil, a $100 payment, a small transaction, doesn't require any underlying documentation, then the expectation is that that is going to be achieved in real time. However, when it comes to a global treasurer sending north of $50 million equivalent into an emerging or a frontier market, which requires underlying documentation, there's compliance checks, it's much more sensitive. And therefore, the priority of that global treasurer is not, in fact, real time. In fact, it's more settlement certainty, transparency, consistency. And so the priorities really shift when it comes to your emerging and frontier. So I think that's really important to point out. Now, that hasn't stopped us as a business, absolutely, looking at our correspondent banking network, partnering with them to reduce those settlement times, and we're really proud to say that we've achieved that in a lot of these markets, from T+2 to T+1, even T actually on with many of these markets. But I think that's very important to distinguish the difference in the landscape, and those particular priorities can actually be quite different.
So we're talking about the landscape and differences, but let's still talk about these emerging markets. What are the issues in cross-border payments that are close to being resolved?
So I think cross-border payments capabilities, again, it's seen a huge amount of progression in the last 15 to 20 years. But again, that distinction between your G20 and then your emerging frontier, the landscape differs again quite dramatically. And so it's quite interesting to see how a lot of these fintech players have come in and they've bridged a lot of those gaps in those developed markets to really improve or accelerate a lot of the payments capabilities and demystify some of those transaction costs. But again, the emerging and frontier, they will often turn to a StoneX to improve their STP capabilities, to improve their banking infrastructure. And what's been quite interesting is over the course of the years, actually, we've seen massive improvements in MT capabilities, in improving tracking and visibility of funds. And we're really proud to say that we've actually partnered with a lot of these correspondent banks to do that and improve their banking infrastructure so that they can cite these funds in real time, so that they can be SWIFT GPI enabled. And that's one of the reasons why we invested in our SWIFT Technology Service Bureau, because we saw it as a really easy way to contribute and partner with these correspondent banks to improve a lot of those capabilities, which certainly are very close to being resolved. They've improved dramatically. And we're very proud to say that we've been a partner in that process.
Thank you. Now, as a bank, you are licensed in Brazil and Colombia. So could you tell us a little bit more about the complexities around processing receivables and payments, and also how are those being navigated?
So I think what's really important to point out in Brazil and Colombia is that we've seen a massive surge in demand across our largest institutional client base, in fact. And what's actually very interesting is it's been across a very diverse set of payment types as well, from your retail, your e-commerce, your commercial transactions, again, up to the 200 million mark. It's been quite interesting to see that progression over the last several years. And I think what's important is that these markets are incredibly complex to navigate for clients. And so we've really invested in having that onshore presence so that clients can seamlessly move money in and out of the country. Because with taking Brazil, for example, there's certain documentation that's required from the beneficiaries and clients. There's evidence that they are due to receive those funds. There's taxing reporting requirements, regulatory reporting requirements, and so it can make it quite difficult to interpret a lot of that. So we've invested a huge amount in our technology to make it as seamless as possible in terms of digitalizing that process, but really having command of the FX and the regulatory expertise on the ground is where we've really shown our strength. But this has massively benefited the beneficiaries and the clients to make that much more achievable, because it's an incredibly complex market to navigate. However, there has been that growth in demand and we are seeing it more and more. So being able to kind of bring that all together and make it as seamless as possible is definitely a forte of StoneX.
So challenges obviously come with emerging markets, but so do opportunities. And you've just mentioned growth there and innovation. Can you give us a few more examples of that? And also how perhaps it's the emerging markets that may become in the forefront of payments transformation. Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yes, so I think again, just taking it back to StoneX for a second, actually, if we look at our product offering, it's really been born out of the inefficiencies in a lot of these emerging markets. There's definitely some of the most complex use cases in terms of moving money around the world. It can be extremely complex. And so it's quite interesting to see how a lot of these emerging markets have come up with these creative solutions to try and be able to kind of bypass a lot of that or leapfrog. And I think a great example of that is in fact in Kenya with M-Pesa. What they've done is they've almost leapfrogged and skipped past a lot of the banking infrastructural challenges that they've been experiencing traditionally, and they've been able to use these new technologies or these alternative payment methods to make the journey much more seamless when it comes to moving money. So I think that's a really good example, and we always make sure as a business with StoneX that we are constantly investing in our correspondent banking network, making sure that we are in touch and connected with these new rails through our correspondent banking partners. So I think that example would probably be the one that I draw out.
Emily, it's been fascinating listening to you, and I love that example of the leapfrog as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.